everybody. You're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining CyberSecurity. I'm Sean Martin, your host, who I get to talk to loads of cool people about cool topics. I think they're cool. Cybersecurity is cool, even if it's a bit nerdy. But it's an important piece of running a business, and it's an important piece of keeping things safe and running smoothly in society. And sometimes organizations, sometimes government needs to step in and give us a hand. And we're going to talk about one of those things coming from the European Commission, the Cyber Resilience Act. And I'm thrilled to have Sarah Fluchs on. Sarah, how are you?
Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you as well. This has been a session in the making for a while. We finally connected, so I'm thrilled to have you on the show. Perhaps you could take a moment to kind of give folks a background on your role, your connection to the EC, the European Commission, and then we'll get into the Act itself.
Yeah, sure. So I do not work for the European Commission. That's very important to say at the very
Yes,
beginning.
of course.
For my background, I'm a mechanical engineer, automation engineer by background, and I've been working on OT cybersecurity, so industrial control system cybersecurity ever since. And professionally, I'm the CTO of admeritia, which is a consulting company working on for 20 years now on OT cybersecurity, a variety of topics, but always in the industrial sector. And as a CTO, I'm responsible for our research, for our tooling, and for the methods that we use. And because cybersecurity, as you rightly said in the introduction, is always a bit driven by standards and regulation and governments, I'm also pretty active in standardization and in consulting governments on certain regulation. And regarding CRA, I'm a member, a type A member in my personal capacity of the CRA expert group at the EU Commission, which was founded this year to help consult with implementation and guidance around the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act. Beyond that, I'm also working pretty much in standardization, so industrial cybersecurity standardization at ISA 62443. And as these are all standards that are probably going to play a role in CRA and Cyber Resilience Act, it definitely makes sense to have both of that to have the whole picture.
And it's interesting. I want to touch on this quickly before we get into the actual act, because the ISA is the International Society of Automation. And when I think of automation, I typically think of ways to get the human out of the way, right? Let things move more smoothly, hopefully, and perhaps a little faster than a human can do things as well. Big in the manufacturing space, certainly big in the critical infrastructure space when we look at valves and pressure systems and that whole thing working hand in hand with each other. It can be a double-edged sword, right? Automation, where if you automate something bad, it can explode it in a bad way, or not. I don't want to say the word explode, but it can automate something bad and scale that bad trait throughout. But it can also, if done properly, kind of go to the point where we're talking about, which is resilience. If you can build the resilience in the automation, it can really ensure something looks a little better, operates a little better. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that in regard to what we're going to talk about here in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, what you described regarding automation, that's exactly what industrial automation is about. So it can be manufacturing and robots, and it can be process industry with valves, and a lot of critical infrastructures are automated, our water utilities and the power grid and things like that. And that's why resilience in these systems plays such an important role. Definitely, because it's always also about the resilience of our critical infrastructures and of our large production facilities.
So let's get into the act itself. Can you give us a little background on when it came together, uh, maybe what some of the drivers were based on your understanding, what the triggers were for it to become law out of the EU?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to know about the CRA that it has a huge scope. So it's not just about automation systems or industrial automation that we just talked about, but it's really about every digital product. So that's basically really, if you look around at your desk at all the devices that are there, they're probably all in scope of the CRA. It's easier to find examples for what's not in scope than for what is in scope. So like a basic calculator that you've been using at school, that's probably not in scope, but everything else really is. So all digital devices that you have are in scope. Um, and that's also one reason why it's difficult for manufacturers of components in industrial space um, often to interpret the CRA for them because it has not always been written specifically with these specific products in mind. But that's another issue. The CRA in general is from an an European Union perspective, it's the general framework that it uses is not new. So it's the CE marking that we have for different kind of products, mostly for safety reasons. So, for example, sunglasses have a CE marking on them that says that ensures that they have been produced in a way that they actually protect your eyes from UV rays. Children's toys have a CE marking to make sure that they're actually safe to play for children and things like that. So, so far the CE marking has been about safety. So it's really all about having the same requirements across the entire European Union for everything that's safety or security relevant or safety relevant so far. And now the CRA really is a new legislation under this product harmonization legislation. So having harmonic rules for all products in the European Union. And first time it's aiming at cybersecurity. So in the end, it's also about the safety of the user, but this time it's more about the security from attacks that could come from this device, from these digital devices. And that's why it's the first time about security, but it makes sense to have them under these entire frameworks. And that's why it's so new really in terms of regulation because I'm not aware of any other regulation in the world that has such a broad scope. There are some for IoT devices in UK, for example. There is something for automotive, but that for regulation that really has such a huge scope and is really a hard regulation that says, okay, you need to meet these requirements or else you're not going to sell your product on the European markets. That's really pretty unique, I think, and it's also a reason why a lot of manufacturers are currently really trying to wrap their heads around CRA and saying, I have heard so many manufacturers saying, but the EU Commission can't possibly mean it. I mean, it's really a hard regulation, and unfortunately, well, they can. So, unfortunately, from a manufacturer's perspective, maybe.
Can they have? Oh no, please continue.
Sorry, what was that?
I was said, please. It sounded like you were going to say something else, but I'll actually take this moment. We'll get into the well, they can and how they can, and because how is important. But I want to keep on the scope for a moment because there's another point, and it's right in the opening part of the site that I'm looking at here. So in terms of you mentioned not the calculator, but it does mention baby monitors, right, which sit in a home, smartwatches, things like that, and the software that makes them work, and the information that makes them run, and it speaks to the entire life cycle of the product as well. So from manufacturing to actually running it, and there's a word in there, the retailers, and that to me just kind of makes me twig a little bit. How do the retailers No, I guess they're a part of the chain to say we're only going to, not only can the EU allow something to be sold, but a retailer has to do that double check, I guess.
It's really always about placing on the market. That's the key word. So it's always the CRA always aims at the entity that places a certain product on the EU market. So the first one that sells a product on the EU market is responsible for that it complies with CRA requirements. And that can be, of course, if you think about who could that be, that could be the manufacturer himself, so producing
Or yeah,
something and also
direct, yeah.
placing on the market. It could be, but it could also be a retailer that really just takes the product, buys it from another manufacturer, and then places it first time on the EU market, and they then have to make sure the product complies with CRA. Of course, they can only do that to a certain extent, and because they don't have insights about the production process and things like that. But they need to make sure that all products that they sell, at the very least, have the CE marking. And make sure that they don't have products in their store. That's important for online stores, for example. And it's also
Right.
a big problem that we have in the European Union, for example, with online stores and apps from China, for example, because they just place these products on the market. And if you buy something from these stores as a consumer, depending on where the legal entity is, it could be that you are the importer of that product, and that is really a complicated issue. So yeah, retailers, manufacturers, or importers of the product are the ones that are responsible for complying with the COA requirements, or at least making sure that nothing in their store, nothing they import, nothing that they offer to the European market does not comply.
So there's the making of it, placing it in the market. What about operating? So I'm thinking kind of in terms of the supply chain, perhaps in the middle, but also customer facing, where they might provide a service on top of around the product. And I'm thinking smart cameras or something where they might buy a device and then wrap a service around it to offer additional capabilities or cloud store. I'm making stuff up here, but how does that scenario look in respect to this?
So you mean if you are the manufacturer of a camera or something, and then what? I mean, you place it on the market. You're the one responsible for complying with the
Well, in a
COA
scenario I'm
requirements.
thinking is somebody makes the camera, security camera, and then I provide a service to the home user for
I see. Okay.
monitoring and cloud storage. Oftentimes that's the same person or the same entity, the manufacturer and the service provider. But there may be cases where a service provider uses a device. So I presume they're a retailer, even though they're operating in
But I
that
mean, if
scenario.
you, it's principally the CRA is for products, so it would be for the camera manufacturer. If you, as a reseller, like have another product where you use the camera, that would be something that would be an additional product. So you're responsible for the entire thing, and you have to claim some things from the camera manufacturer in your supply chain. If you just have a service and offer a service using that camera, then that's not technically a new product. So then you're not responsible for the. I mean, you're responsible for making sure that the product that you buy has the CE marking, but your product is the service and not the product, right? So it's about products, about
Okay,
really hardware or software products, not about services.
got it.
There are other
So it is
regulations for
physically
services. So
okay. So there is it literally tied to the physical piece, not the any service around it, cloud service or things like that. Because it
if
does
you
speak to
if you do
software.
have a product, so if you sell a camera as a manufacturer, if you have a camera and you have another cloud service or an app that is required to operate the camera, then that would be in scope of the CRA as well.
Got
Yeah.
it.
So
Okay.
everything is always the product as the consumer would understand it. So and the consumer doesn't care if you have cloud back there that does something for you. If you have an app or something, it's just a camera that does something, and everything that's required to provide this functionality of the camera or any surrounding services are in scope of the CRA if you are the manufacturer of the camera. Absolutely.
So I'm completely ignorant here, which is why I'm throwing all these questions out. You're doing great. You mentioned supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
So does a component entering, I guess, does it have to be an end user facing product, or can it be a B2B product, so part of the supply chain to build something bigger? So let's say the lens on a camera being brought in and then used in a camera that's sold to the consumer. Does that, the manufacturer of the camera, need to have a CE compliant component or a
So
CRA
it
compliant
really
component?
is for all components down the supply chain that are products with digital elements. So a pure lens probably wouldn't be product with a digital element. But if you take a computer, for example, then the computer has a CPU in it, and it has a maybe a camera in it, and maybe there are some other things that the manufacturer of the computer buys from another party. And the CRA applies to all components and to the finished product. So it would apply to everybody that supplies a part of the computer to the manufacturer of the computer, and applies to the manufacturer of the computer that puts it all together to one product. So the manufacturer of the computer basically has the due diligence to do to say, okay, I buy the CPU from someone else, I need to make sure that they have the CE marking as well. And it always depends on, and that's where it becomes tricky if you're the manufacturer of the computer, it always depends on which market you place it, because the CRA only applies to if you place a product on the European market. So if you, as the manufacturer of the computer, buy a CPU from a manufacturer in, I don't know, some other country, and they don't sell it on the European market, but you are the first one who places it on the European market. You're technically the importer, and that makes it difficult for computer manufacturers, for example, because it really the CRA requirements trickle down to all components. So they have to do their due diligence and make sure that all components also comply.
So many places to go with this. We can stick with the manufacturing process. I mean, talk about getting a view into the supply chain. This is going to force that, right? At least for the digital components. Something many countries are struggling with, trying to get a view into what's everything built from. Uh, Talk to me a little bit about who's checking, what are they checking, how are they checking? Are they looking at the manufacturing process? Are they looking at the the importing? What's that whole world look like in terms of validation that this is actually going as they expect?
Well, technically, there's really a lot of things that nobody knows yet in detail because nobody has done it yet. Um, there are some, it's called conformity assessment procedures that are defined. And since the CRA is one of many regulations that we have under this new legislative framework for these harmonized EU requirements, they also have the same conformity assessment procedures. So you can have a procedure. There are different modules how you can that you can apply to do this conformity assessment. And there are different procedures that you can follow. It depends on which procedures you can follow, depends on the type of your product. So there are products in the CRA, there are annexes 3 and 4 that say, okay, you have important and critical products, and if your product has certain characteristics, for example, if it's a hypervisor or a firewall or a smart card, then it qualifies as a important or critical product, and then your choice of procedures or conformity assessment procedures narrows down, because for these kind of products you need to have a third party assessment. So really an external party that will come to your place and check your technical documentation and your product, and if you really do comply with CRA. Otherwise, an internal assessment is sufficient. So you have to check it internally and document that you checked it, so that if a market surveillance authority takes a look at all this, they can see that you actually checked it, that you comply. And then there are different modules how you can beyond these third party and internal, there are different flavors how you can prove compliance. So there is one flavor that says, okay, you don't have to check every product individually, but you can have like a pattern that says, okay, I usually build my products this way, and you have that checked. Or you can have a quality management system that also applies to your design process and your production process, and then you have the quality management system checked. And then there's also a European cybersecurity certification scheme underway that is currently being defined. And that's also going to play a big role in the future in cybersecurity and for the CRA, because that's also going to be one way how conformity can be checked. So you obtain such a certificate, and then that counts as a conformity check. And that, of course, would also be a good way to do it efficiently, because having third-party checks for all these products, and even if it's only the important and critical products, it's just a huge scope, and it's just a lot of products, and there's probably going to be a scarcity of external bodies that can actually do these conformity assessments.
You mentioned a couple really important things there. Um, so when I first think about this, I think of the final product and it being resilient. But then there's that product in an environment, which we'll get into in a moment, that the environment needs to be resilient with that product operating in it. But you mentioned earlier as well the quality process. So the manufacturing process, the quality control process within the manufacturing process. And I know in the U.S., if you deliver something to the Department of Defense, for example, you have to have a certification that doesn't just check the product. It checks your team, it checks your build environment, it checks your quality process.
It checks processes. Yeah, that's right. So your vulnerability handling process and your production process and your design process. I mean, in the end, security by design is a lot about how you actually build security during designing and producing a product. So there's always the one part of really having product characteristics. Is your stored data encrypted, or do you have, what kind of authentication do you have, or things like that? And there's also these big process requirements where say, okay, you need to consider security during your process. You need to have a process for continuous vulnerability checking, for example, so that you at least have a way of noticing if there's unpatched vulnerabilities in your product, for example. And then you need to have a process of really making these vulnerabilities known to your customers, advising them what to do with that. So all these things are things that you can't really see in a product, but that is in the process surrounding this product. And you also have to do a cybersecurity risk assessment. That's also something that you can't see in the product, but that's very essential in CRA, because it really is the linchpin for a lot of cybersecurity decisions, where you can say, okay, based on the risk assessment, you can fine tune how you meet certain requirements and also if they apply.
Does it is the does the objective include ensuring resilience for the manufacturing process? I'm thinking for key components that we use. I don't know if this is just specifically for consumer products, or because I know we're going to talk about OT and critical infrastructure, which things delivered into that space have a big role in society, not just an individual perspective.
What do you say about the zones? What kind of zones?
Does it speak to resilience of the operating of the manufacturing process? So if something is important to be built and we know we're going to need a lot of it, does it ensure that manufacturing process is resilient so it can meet the needs of
well, see, I mean, that's a bit how it's different, how CRA is different from, for example, NIS2 or other critical infrastructure protection. It's not really about protecting the manufacturer. It's about protecting the customer. of this manufacturer.
Got
So
it.
it is about making sure in the design process that the product actually has the characteristics to protect the customer. It is not about the resilience of the production facility of the manufacturer. So that's
Got
not
it.
the target. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Perfect. So let's talk about. I don't know if you have any view into how this is being accepted and how it's impacting manufacturers. Are they because they don't see teeth? They're not acting because they don't. It's not. I don't know. Is it clear enough to actually act upon? Are there enough details in the
Well,
legislation to
there's a
say
lot
here's
of,
one, two, three?
I think I mean, you probably need to differentiate because for every regulation, there's a lot of people saying, criticizing it because, of course, it's work. And admittedly, the CRA really is a lot of work and it is really concerning manufacturers because they really see it's potentially revenue stream disrupting. So they can potentially not sell products anymore if they don't comply or if they have a vulnerability in their product. And that is really something that worries them. And also, um, I mean, you have to pull up more documentation than you had before. There's always, the European Union is always under um, attack for producing too much bureaucracy. And that, of course, is also one point of criticism. I need to say at this point, I mean, there is documentation, but I really don't see that there's unnecessary documentation in the CRA because some things, I mean, how are you going to check them if you don't document them? It's just doesn't really work. There's also a lot of debate and insecurity around the requirements not being very specific. They're quite generic. I mean, the essential requirements in the CRA, that's Annex 1, it's just 1.5 pages. So that's not really much. And it's really, it compared to other regulation, also other regulation for product safety, for example, they have pages and pages, like 30 to 100 pages of detailed requirements in there. And compared to that, these security requirements are really generic. And that, of course, depending on what your approach is to cybersecurity, that's good or bad news. Because I mean they leave a lot of leeway for interpretation, and I think that's a good thing. It's better than suffocating companies in detailed requirements that you need to check, and that wouldn't even be possible because the scope is so big. How you're actually going to word requirements that apply to this big kind of scope when these devices that are covered are so different. But of course, that's also one point of criticism. And I mean, there are the harmonized standards. That's also one thing that's typical about this kind of regulation in Europe, that the legislation actually only has essential requirements. And then there are harmonized standards that specify and concretize these requirements for different kinds of products. So for comparison, for example, the machinery regulation, that is the same kind of regulation that applies to machinery, having safety requirements for machinery. And recently there also some security requirements were added. They have more than 800 harmonized standards. So for every kind of um, machine that would be in the scope, there are different harmonized standards. So depending on if you have a crane or a tractor or whatever, you really have specified requirements. And that's a bit what manufacturers are used to. And that's why they're understandably a bit taken aback by this CRA, which only has 1.5 pages of requirements and no harmonized standards yet. And the European Commission has required European standardization organizations to pull up and to create these harmonized standards. But there's only a really short time frame. It is really hard to produce standards that in a certain quality, in a consensus-based manner, how international standards need to be produced. There are certain rounds of where comments are collected and they need to be resolved, and everybody needs to be asked for their opinion, and all national bodies need to be able to comment and things like that. It just takes time. So the harmonized standards are, for the majority of products, are just not likely to be issued in time. And
Right.
that, of course, is something that raises insecurity among
Mm.
manufacturers because they don't really have a clear checklist to boxes to tick to say, okay, I just have these requirements and I follow these and then I'm good. And that means that you have to do a lot of interpretation and of the 1.5 pages of requirements that are actually there. And I think that's not just a bad thing, but it's a point of insecurity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a checklist is one thing, and it's something presumably, whether it's even if it's just a page and a half long of checklist, not 600 pages or 800 pages, whatever it might be, it's a checklist, right? So checklist would be good, but then when I think of this from a security perspective, and you mentioned the word vulnerability, vulnerability assessment of the application or the product, there's no such thing as 100%. So that isn't a removing vulnerabilities isn't a checklist, in my opinion. it's a bar.
That's right. Yeah, it's a
And
process
who knows
in the end.
how that bar sits and what's important for a different product and who determines that. And so, has there
I
been
mean,
any
the
thought
CRA
or
says you need to
presentation?
place a product on the market that's free of known and exploitable vulnerabilities. That's pretty clear. This also was worrying
Okay, so known. Okay,
many
that
manufacturers. Yeah.
so known vulnerabilities is clear, but introducing your own new ones is
Yeah, that's right.
more likely the case. Does how does it address that? Does it address that?
Like that you're not producing more vulnerabilities in product or
Yeah. How does is it addressing the potential when very likely potential of new vulnerabilities being introduced that can be exploited, or is it solely focused on known and
yeah.
keeping those out?
Yeah, I mean, that's why you have these entire vulnerability handling requirements that really take up a big portion of the CRA requirements for a reason, because obviously you can securely design a product, can have all the processes, you can have a risk assessment, and then it's really about following up on vulnerabilities that may become known and they may not even be your fault. I mean, if you have a product and you integrate someone else's product and that has a vulnerability in there, well, then you also have the vulnerability in your product and you need to do something about that. And that's why there are so many requirements on vulnerability handling. So you have to scan your product for vulnerabilities um, in frequently, in certain frequencies. You have to disclose vulnerabilities. You have to have a procedure for responsible disclosure. So if someone finds a vulnerability in your product, they can responsibly give that to you and provide you with time to fix it before you disclose it to the public. You have to, if there is an exploited vulnerability, so that would be more an incident than a vulnerability. So you have knowledge of actual exploitation of the vulnerability in your product. You have to make that known to national security authorities and also to ENISA, which is the European Security Authority. And you also have to notify your customers of vulnerabilities that you have in your product, and you are also required. It's mandatory that you offer free security patches over the product's lifetime. And the lifetime, that was a point of discussion during CRA creation, because I mean, we have such a broad scope of products. What is a good lifetime for a product? I mean, do I have to ensure security updates for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? It really it depends on the industry that you have there. And I think in the first draft, it was 5 years. And nobody was happy with that because, on the one hand, like IT consumer products said, okay, but sometimes our product isn't even used for 5 years. Take the good example, for example, are COVID warning apps or things like that we had only as long as the pandemic lasted, and then they weren't used anymore. And in other cases, in industry where I'm mostly working, I mean, they have life cycles of decades. So 5 years is nothing for a PLC, for example, for a control system. And there it makes sense to have much longer lifespans. And now there's a compromise in there saying, okay, you need to determine your life cycle um, depending on the actual use of your product. you need to have good arguments for that. And also the European Commission is probably going to put out some guidance on typical um, updating periods and lifespans for different kind of products. And the minimum is 5 years unless you can argue otherwise, for example, the COVID warning apps. Yeah. And you have to provide free updates over the course of this lifespan. And I think it's
And
really a game changer for customers because it's not
yeah,
guaranteed so far, and that really makes a difference.
yeah, it's interesting that scope as well. I can obviously we're talking about the straightforward, ensure the product is secure and resilient. We talked about the process as well, but the disclosure of vulnerabilities, the patching of vulnerability, reporting on incidents. There's a lot in the act. It's covered. Um, so
It
you
really
brought
is.
up.
I
Oh,
think
go ahead.
that's what security people like about the CRA. It really reads like a wish list of security good practices. So
It's
it's
a
really
security
not.
program.
That's right. I
Do you
mean,
have a program? Yeah.
it's not absurd requirements. It's not like an endless list of requirements, but it really is what most security experts agree on makes sense for product security. And that's also during the creation of CRA, there wasn't really any discussion on should we have these requirements or not. All the discussions were about details. So one member of the EU Commission even told me that they were surprised that CRA was not political at all. So there wasn't any debate on do we actually need this, or do we really have to put all these requirements in there, or can we put this requirement in or out? But that really mainly was a discussion on application, on scope, of course, and on details. So like the lifespan, open source was a big issue because how do you ensure cybersecurity for open source products? It's such a big category of products where you don't really have someone that you can make responsible, for example. So that was a big issue. But the core of the essential requirements wasn't really an issue. And I think, and it still isn't, because it really is what we all know needs to be done at some point. And the supply chain attacks that we have seen in the past just shows that it's time, and it's about time that not just operators of products or critical infrastructures are responsible for security, because they can only be responsible to a certain extent, and then they don't come any further without their manufacturers, and that's why it's just the next logical step in the chain.
Yeah. I want to quickly. We're coming up to the end here, but I want to quickly touch on that point on critical infrastructure and the OT environments that support them. What impact will this have on them? I can see a positive impact if it actually all comes together, because they're going to get more resilient products to run their infrastructures. Hopefully, I didn't cut out there.
There was a small glitch in the audio. What impact does this have on critical infrastructures? Did you say that?
Yes, yes,
Okay. Um, well, I mean, obviously they're not directly impacted. It's not their regulation, and they're happy about that. It's for once it's not their regulation, but
that's
someone else
right.
needs to do that something. Um, what we see is that, I mean, the CRA was also something that's important to have in mind. One explicit goal of the CRA is also to make lives for critical infrastructure and NIS2 operators easier, because they have acknowledged that, um, I think also based on industry feedback, it is really hard to be an operator if you have insecure components and to be responsible for cybersecurity. So it's really also an intent to make cybersecurity easier for operators like this and for critical infrastructure operators. And I think the probably biggest visible change that they have is, I mean, one, the vulnerability process that they really actually that's not normal nowadays, that they actually get an information on that there's a vulnerability and what they need to do. In the supply chain attacks and the things that we've seen before, there are huge differences between manufacturers and if they react at all, if you tell them that there's a vulnerability, if they have any advice or if they don't. So that's a big change. And then a second big change that I think is underreported is that suddenly with the CRA, for every product, customers have to get it's called information and instructions to the user. So like a cybersecurity manual, where all the relevant information for the user is put in. And that probably is for consumer products. It's probably just going to be another stack of paper that everybody throws away and nobody reads. But for critical infrastructure operators, that is really information that is valuable, because I can't recount the hours that I've spent on the phone on behalf of infrastructure operators trying to get all this information from manufacturers that they are now forced to put into these information instructions to the user. It's just about the basic functionality, about what protocols are being used, about how does updating work, how can I switch from default updating to other updating processes, which risks did I actually consider and which risks didn't I consider? Because then the critical infrastructure operator, they do have to do their own risk assessments. So all information that they can get about risk assessments, about their components, helps them in doing their own risk assessments. So that really, I think, is going to make a difference, at least if manufacturers take this seriously. And that's also where I'm hoping for a bit of a competition between manufacturers doing that well or less well.
Yes, security is a competitive differentiator. Finally, finally, we'll probably see it. Yeah, but I love this idea of don't just hard code the password, right? The admin and password.
Right.
Make it that's a security by design, secure by design thing. But then also document it and let people know they should change it in the manufacturing environment.
And
Here's
of
how
course,
to
this
change it, right?
documentation, it's boring. Nobody likes
Yeah.
it, likes doing it, but there are efficient ways to do that, and it really makes such a big difference for users, that for end users of the product. Yeah, especially if they are under regulation as well, and if they need to prove that they have thought about cybersecurity as well, because they're getting asked the same questions in the end. And they're getting asked about their risk assessment, so they need this information.
I still have a gazillion questions, Sarah, but I think sadly we've run out of time. I wanted to talk about connection to NIS2 and GDPR perhaps, and yeah, the role the end user has to play in support of all this. But I don't know. Maybe we can have another chat at some point and keep the conversation going. You know so much about this. I'm thrilled to have had you on and enlighten me. I know something now, which is way more than I knew earlier this morning when we were preparing for this. So, Sarah, thank you so much for doing this work. Thanks for joining me on the show. Any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience?
Uh, I think the biggest, most important thing about CRA that I tell everybody who's approaching me nowadays, so talking about a lot of manufacturers, is you don't have to be afraid of all this. I mean, it's really, every time I get in touch with the EU Commission and ask them questions and try to find out their intentions, they're trying to do the right things and the good things, and they're not going to chastise you for doing a small detail wrong. It's not about that. It's about doing the big picture right. And don't it's no need to panic about that, as long as you really care about cybersecurity.
Yeah. I think that's the key. Care about cyber. Do the right thing from a cyber perspective from the beginning. This becomes less of an issue.
That's awesome about CRA, really. That's why I like CRA, and what I always try to tell people: if you want to do things right for cybersecurity, you're also doing things right for the CRA. It's not, you don't have to do things just for compliance and checking boxes, and that's not normal for regulation. It could be worse, much worse.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, Sarah, you're fantastic. Thanks again for joining me, and we'll include links to the CRE resource and anything else Sarah thinks would be good reading or watching or listening for folks. And of course, do stay tuned for more Redefining Cybersecurity. Subscribe, share with your friends and enemies, and love you all. We'll see you again on the next episode.
Thanks for having me.